China's new confirmed infections from the coronavirus outbreak increased by a daily record to top 14,000. The growing epidemic prompted global travel restrictions and evacuations. The death toll from the outbreak in China has now reached 304. All the new deaths and most of the new infections were in central Hubei province, the epicenter of the flu-like coronavirus outbreak. China is facing mounting isolation as other countries introduce travel curbs, airlines suspend flights, and governments evacuate their citizens. The World Health Organization declared the outbreak a public health emergency of international concern, but said that global trade and travel restrictions are not needed. Meanwhile, the government of Botswana has reported 4 more suspected cases of coronavirus since the first suspected case was reported on Thursday. According to a statement by the Ministry of Health and Wellness, all 5 cases were registered at the Siretsakgama International Airport.
As of now, what we have done as a country, which has been an ongoing process of public health emergency preparedness, was to train rapid response teams nationwide. And so far, we have activated them. And we are doing the retrainings and hopefully in the near future simulations so that early case identification can be done to ensure that there is no unnecessary exposure to the rest of the population.
Vietnam Airlines and Vietjet will resume flights to Hong Kong, Taiwan and Macau from Sunday, the company said, after the Hanoi government eased restrictions over virus concerns. Vietnam on Saturday declared a public health emergency over the coronavirus epidemic and said it would halt all flights to and from China, including Hong Kong, Macau and Taiwan. Grace Lee is our correspondent in Hong Kong, and she joins us now live for an update. Grace, a very good morning. Thanks for joining us. All these efforts to contain coronavirus. What's the latest? What can you tell us?
Well, we're seeing countries rapidly respond to the virus by shutting down their borders to China. New Zealand is the latest to announce some heavy measures. This comes as we hear reports of a Wuhan man who is in the Philippines being diagnosed and now announced dead. That kind of marks the first time that a case from outside of China has a death. So we're monitoring the situation very closely. But as we hear these kinds of increased reports of illnesses and now this first death outside of China, we can certainly expect to see countries surrounding China ramp up their efforts to further try and contain the situation.
What's the official situation now in terms of all the restricted flights that had been reported on earlier? Have those restrictions been relaxed or are they being strengthened?
Absolutely. There are so many countries now that have travel restrictions on China. For example, the U.S. now considers this a national health emergency. Hong Kong here has announced it as an emergency as well, but it has so far refused to shut down its border. That has made people here in Hong Kong very unhappy. Several health officials, doctors and nurses are planning to go on strike on Monday to try and convince the government to take further measures. Meanwhile, in Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, all these countries have announced that they will be closing their borders to China in an effort to contain the situation. Now, the WHO has said that this is not the response they were hoping for. They were asking countries to keep their borders open and instead stay vigilant in washing your hands and wearing your face mask, doing all these other things to prevent the virus from spreading. They're worried about what the economic impact might be a couple months down the line.
Amid all of this, there's talk about traditions and China being supposed to have celebrations of the new year. What's the feeling like on the streets, especially where you are?
Yeah, well, the new year wasn't a very happy one to ring in for folks here in Hong Kong or in China. The New Year kind of holiday has been extended even further here in Hong Kong. Officials aren't going back to work until the beginning of February in a couple of days, and schools are being shuttered until March. A very similar situation in mainland China where students are being asked not to come to school, people are being asked not to come to work. Now, all of this is because they've had experience with these kinds of diseases. You'll remember SARS in the early 2000s. That hit Hong Kong and China very hard. Here in Hong Kong, 300 out of the 700 people who died during that time were Hong Kong residents. So they're trying to take this very seriously and take the necessary precautions. But so far, it seems that the virus is still spreading despite these efforts. So in Hong Kong and elsewhere in Asia, the officials are trying to remain vigilant.
Let's hone in on Hong Kong now. What's the latest in terms of the 66 suspected cases that were reported on?
So far, I believe the count is about 13 people, but that number grows so rapidly without any warning, especially the cases from China as well. But in terms of people that are ill at the moment, I think the government has said that they have about 80 people under quarantine and under observation to make sure that they're not sick with this flu. Now, in terms of the virus, it's being widely reported that 14 days is the incubation period for this virus. And you mentioned the Chinese New Year holiday. Thousands of residents from Wuhan traveled abroad during that time. A lot of them still aren't back in China. So in areas around China, like here in Hong Kong, in Japan, South Korea, these hotspot destinations for Chinese tourists, they're expecting that during that time, the virus might have spread and that we might start seeing those cases jump up in the next couple of days.
One of the big stories we reported on in terms of Hong Kong, the entire 2019, was a protest, government protest. And that requires a lot of people to come together in one area. And one of the countermeasures that have been released by the World Health Organization and by governments all over the world is to avoid getting together in groups. How has the outbreak of the coronavirus affected protest in Hong Kong?
Yeah, well, it's been, 7-8 long months of protests here in Hong Kong. And as you kind of may remember, the protests were starting to kind of peter off in the beginning of January, but the economic impact of these protests have been pretty profound. Now we see this virus coming in, and during the early 2000s, during the SARS virus, Hong Kong's economy was wrecked during that time. So there is a lot of concern of what this might mean for Hong Kong's financial future. In terms of the gatherings, we haven't seen any big gatherings for these protests so far. Everybody's staying at home and trying to avoid big crowds, trying to avoid contact with other people, possibly people who might have been to China recently. So we can expect that the protest situation will be a lot quieter, but that doesn't mean that people here are happy and that they're, content with the situation or that they've forgotten the reason why these protests have begun. There's a lot of mounting anger towards China, especially because we're hearing reports about the fact that a lot of Chinese officials tried to cover up the outbreak of this virus in the early days, and that's why we've seen this spread so rapidly.
Okay, we earlier spoke about the incidences of people with the coronavirus in Hong Kong. Has there been any reports of deaths?
No reports of deaths so far in Hong Kong. Outside of China, the situation still seems pretty controlled so far, but there is a lot of fear. If you see what's been happening in and around Asia at the moment, face masks are impossible to find. People are stockpiling any kind of medical supplies, hand sanitizers, sanitizing wipes, anything that they can use to protect themselves against this virus. People are trying to get a hold of. I've spoken to people who waited 2 hours in line to try and get some face masks. So there is a lot of paranoia, a lot of fake news surrounding the outbreak as well. In China, we're hearing reports that people are starting to abandon their pets because there are false reports that the pets can give you coronavirus. That is simply not true according to the WHO. So there is a lot happening here despite the fact that there haven't been any deaths reported quite yet.
And just finally, Grace, we've been reporting the whole week in terms of restriction of movement in mainland China. What is the situation like in Hong Kong? Is it the same?
In Hong Kong, well, actually, a lot of people are trying to get out while they can. I've spoken to several expats who think that, I spoke about the economy a little bit earlier, with the effect that the protests have been having, and now with the coronavirus, a lot of people simply don't see a future here. They think their jobs are at stake, so they're trying to get out while they can. And a couple of countries have already restricted travel access to China because there is that link to the mainland, and Hong Kong hasn't shut down its border completely. So there is a lot of worry that, that a lot of people from the mainland might be coming to Hong Kong to try and get treatment. But you'll remember that in Wuhan right now, there is a lockdown. The Chinese government has contained all of the citizens in that area so far. So we won't be seeing visitors from that area, but certainly we are still seeing visitors from the mainland in general.
Thank you so much for that update. Grace Lee is giving us an update on the efforts to contain coronavirus, especially in this regard in Asia.